Well, good evening, ladies and gentlemen. We're so glad you're here tonight. My name's Frank Hardiman, and I, along with my partner, Mary Eberline in the back, have brought you Smart Towns to Rochester Hills. This is a program that we came up with about a year ago, and we thought it would be important to have this kind of program in our community. We reached out to a lot of different partners, and they're announced on the board, and we couldn't believe the response we got in terms of how excited they were to provide an educational program in our community each year based on one theme. And this year's theme is the Gilded Age of America, 1870 to 1900. We have enormous amounts of programs, like almost 20 now, between now and the end of the year. And they're going to be located in all these different locations. About a week ago or so, we had our first Smart Towns lecture on women and God in that time frame. It was an extraordinary performance by Dr. Ann Nicholson over at Rochester College. And we have programs, we have programs dealing with architecture like tonight, with music, with history, with railroads, with all different kinds of topics. Before you get out of here tonight, embed that webpage on your brain and go back in there and check and see all the different programs are going to be available to you, and most of them at no cost. They're going to do a Tiffany collection series at Meadowbrook Hall. Matilda collected a lot of the Tiffany products, and they've had them in the closet for a long period of time. They're going to have a big celebration on that. They're going to do the automobile industry, as you might expect, because of John Dodge. Just going to have a number of extraordinary programs. These are your sponsors. This is your webpage. And our next two programs are on April 25th and May 15th. And at Van Hoosen Museum, we're going to talk about Rochester and America's Gilded Age. And I have a little note here from our speaker, Pat McKay, who says, we're going to be talking about what's happening in Rochester during the age of robber barons, westward expansion and railroads. How did the inventions and scientific advancements of Levi Strauss, Burbank, Carver, Edison, Ford, Tesla, and Westinghouse affect the local residents? Pat is an expert in this field, and he's going to speak at the museum. Then on the 15th, we have one of the professors at Oakland University speaking at Meadowbrook Hall on protests against the New Order, the rise of populism. We're grateful that you're here tonight. We want you to know about this program. We want you to speak about it to your friends, and hopefully you'll come back to many of the programs. As I said, most of them are free of charge, and it's designed to enlighten and inspire our people in our community in this educational endeavor. Tonight you got another special. Tonight we have Joe Odoefer. I have a long list of things that Joe has done, but I'm only going to talk about a few. Joe is the, whoops, I guess I messed that up. Joe is the Associate Dean and Professor at the School of Architecture at the University of Detroit Mercy. His passion and love is in the Gilded Age. His history and his teaching is in the Gilded Age. I think we're going to be hearing him talk about the Boston Public Library, the 1893 World's Columbian Exposition, the Library of Congress, and a whole bunch of other stuff that most of us don't think about 130, 40 years ago. It was all part of the making of this great country of ours, America. I also know that Joe did his degrees, his undergraduate and his graduate degrees from the University of Detroit, and he teaches in topics that I'd love to participate in sometime. Design studio and technology integration, environmental technology, principles of structural behavior, history of architecture, 1750 to the present, and history of American architecture from 1865 to 1929. He's the expert. He's going to share his experience and his background, his education in this field. So let me introduce Joe Odoefer. get you up here right away. Nope. Oh, here you are. It's all yours, Joe. Thank you. Let me get my phone out of your way. Thanks.
Thank you, Frank, for that kind introduction. It is a period near and dear to my heart. About 10 years ago, my wife and I went to Newport, and I fell in love with the architecture there. I came back and asked my dean if I could teach a course on the Gilded Age, and I've been teaching it ever since. The American Renaissance is a period or a movement in architecture within the Gilded Age. So it occurs maybe about 1876 is when the ideas begin to formulate, ends around the end of World War I. A little closer. All right, can you hear me now? All right, so the American Renaissance begins about 1876, at least the idea for it begins about 1876. People don't start using the term until the 1880s, and we really don't see architecture until the 1880s. Can you hear me now? No. Is it turned on? Closer? Okay. I feel a little funny, like I'm about to eat, I don't know. But it begins about 1876. That continues till the end of World War I or a little after. At least that's when the movement has its force, when it's the dominant movement in the United States. One way of thinking about it is the democratization of the Gilded Age. So that during the Gilded Age, at least in the beginning period, what was happening is architects were building mansions for wealthy I don't want to say robber barons because not all of them were robber barons. That they were certainly building large homes for captains of industry who were trying to establish their position in society. People like the Vanderbilts who didn't come from the old American families, that they were new wealth. And one way of establishing your position in society is you build a big house, you have a party, and everyone wants to get invited to your party to see your house, and so you get accepted by those people that have been around for a long time. What happens in the American Renaissance is that architects and artists and business people as well want to extend that lifestyle to everyday people. They feel that the United States is really the heir to European civilization. In particular, what they feel is that in the United States, there's something equivalent to the Renaissance occurring. There's a second Renaissance happening in the United States that, in terms of commerce and in terms of art. Now, the impetus for that was the Centennial Exhibition in Philadelphia in 1876. What happened there was people became cognizant of American history. And one of the things that they saw was that American architecture, Georgian and federal, had its roots in the Italian Renaissance. You know, it came via England, but England was copying Italian architecture, and they saw that really that was the architecture of the founding fathers. That was the architecture that America began with. They also became aware of all the art that was occurring in the United States. You know, that art museums were a rare thing at the time. You know, we think of every city has an art museum. At the time period, art museums were few and far between, so that most people had no interaction with art. You know, art occurred in churches, art occurred in the homes of the wealthy, but it really didn't occur much anywhere else. There were a few large cities that had museums, but like I said, they were very rare. So they saw all this art that was being produced in the United States, and they got excited about it. They felt that America was coming into its own. And they began to see parallels between what was going on in Renaissance Italy and what was happening in the United States. One of the parallels was that America was going through a period of urbanization, just like happened in the Renaissance. That one of the differences between the Middle Ages and the Renaissance in Italy is that people started moving from rural environments to towns. And so you have higher density environments. And the architecture becomes urban in character. That's one of the reasons why during the Renaissance they looked to ancient Rome, because ancient Rome's architecture was urban in character. It's not wanting to go here. Let's try this. There's a message here. You probably can't see it. There we go. So this is the United States, New York, the architecture of McKim, Mead, and White, and they're dealing with the same kind of urban issues, the same high density. You know, even higher densities. At this point in time, you know, once we get to around 1910, there are 3 cities in the United States that have populations over 1 million people. If you look at the period from, say, you know, the beginning of this 1875 to 1915, you see a 5-fold increase in the urban population. So a lot of people are moving to cities, and architects are very interested in urban issues. So the Renaissance is a good model, especially the Italian Renaissance. Also, they saw it as a time of learning. They felt that what was happening in the United States, it was that there was a new spirit of scientific, an embrace of science, a new spirit of learning, that universities were being established. Architectural schools were just beginning to be established in the United States, so this emphasis on learning. Even in the design method, they used something called scientific eclecticism, where architecture was based on a study of history, so that architects, to be a good architect, you had to have a good knowledge of history. Also during the Renaissance, there was an incredible integration that occurred between all of the arts, particularly the visual arts. So that you see in architecture, mural painting, you see architectural sculpture. All this was happening in the Renaissance with people like Michelangelo and Raphael, that a similar kind of thing was happening in the United States. This is John Singer Sargent. It's the Boston Institute of Fine Arts. At the time period, Sargent was one of the most famous mural painters, or excuse me, one of the most famous portrait painters of his day. Back at a time, just to get an idea of numbers, multiply whatever I say by 30, and that'll give you a rough idea of what we're talking about in today's dollars. His portraits were selling for $5,000 a portrait. So if you multiply that times 30, you're talking about serious money. He did these murals at a fraction of that cost, so that, you know, he spent decades working on murals for the Boston Public Library and for the Institute of Arts, and got minuscule fees for it. But they were, artists at the period were so committed to exposing the general public to art that they went ahead and did it, even though they weren't making much of a profit on it. Probably covered his paint. With architecture, what generally happens is an idea begins in residential architecture, and then it goes on to public buildings. So this is one of the first buildings of the American Renaissance. It's by McKim, Mead, and White. Yes? Can't hear you. All right, I'll keep it up here really close. I'm just old and my arms are getting tired holding this thing up. Yeah, I have that problem too. But it's one of the first buildings of the American Renaissance, so that it's done in an Italian Renaissance style, that a lot of the details were taken from Roman palazzi. mural painting by John Lafarge. Some really beautiful architectural sculpture by Augustus St. Gaudens. I'll show you some of the work of these artists later. But I just want to give you a feeling for when it begins. But it's based on a Renaissance palazzo plan, kind of half of a palazzo. Palazzo is kind of a donut plan, so a square building with a hole in it. This is the first public building that was done in the American Renaissance. It's the Boston Public Library, again by McKim, Mead, and White. Charles McKim was, I think, the 9th American to study at the École des Beaux-Arts in Paris, so that he had an excellent education, studied there for about 3 years, and then came back and worked for H.H. Richardson, who did the building right at the bottom of the screen. I'm looking. If I point, can you see? I get that. This building right here with the arrow was done by H.H. Richardson. This is the building by McKim. If you look at them, they look radically different. What McKim felt was that the kind of romantic architecture that was occurring at the time period was wrong for a densely urban environment, because all the buildings were kind of aspiring upwards. You know, if you look at the church next to his building, it has that tall steeple. The townhouses have those vertical bays. That all of them are sort of have a movement upward. The other thing that they have is they're all a dark color palette. And he felt that it made the city look gloomy. And he felt that those buildings, when they aspire vertically, they tend to separate from one another, so that you have this clash of individual buildings. There wasn't a sense of unity. So what he does is, if you look at his building, it's much more horizontal. So you can see that there are horizontal lines that run across the building. There's a heavy cornice up at the top. And what that does is it ties it into the urban context. Now, if you look at the building, it sort of pulls the church and the townhouses together as a unit. The other thing that he did, which was kind of different than what a Renaissance architect would do, is that he doesn't feel the need to change everything. You know, if a Renaissance architect was doing this, if Michelangelo came in here, what he would do is he would build a new facade on all the buildings around it, so that everything would be unified. But what McKim understands is that a city is about diversity, especially an American city. So that what you want is not all one kind of building. You want this variety of buildings. And he's offering that variety, and he's lightening up the color palette. So this is done in pink Milford granite. Let me show you what well, this is an earlier drawing, but I'll show you in just a minute. It's a much lighter color palette than existed in the other buildings. Here's the building actually built. So he's drawing on a variety of sources, so that he has that Renaissance palazzo plan with a cortile or courtyard in the center, which is a good urban form because it gives you a nice, quiet interior space. So that's why it works well in an urban environment. He takes the reading room, pulls it up off the street. So if you look at the top here, you can see a row of arches running on the second story right here. That basically, that's the reading room. So the reading room is lifted up off the street level so that it's quieter. It's expressed on the outside of the building. So you can see that most important element of the building as you approach the structure. That it has a generous entrance. You can see 3 arches form the entrance to the building, so it makes it feel more public. In fact, at the time period, people were so excited about the building, they started calling it a palace for the people. So it's that idea of taking what the wealthy had and bringing it to everyday people, which is what I mean by, one way of talking about it is you can say it's the democratization of luxury. So you bring that luxurious lifestyle to everyone, which you really have to do in a democracy. And a lot of the wealthy people at the time period found that out the hard way. That the Villard houses that I showed you earlier, he actually had to close, or his railroad collapsed, And he actually had rioting in front of his house. His house wasn't as big as it actually looked. It was actually 6 units in that house, but people thought it was all his house, and so he had to sneak out the back door and escape to his country house. If you look at the entrance to the library, it makes a statement about art as soon as you arrive, so that you walk between a pair of statues done by Bella Pratt, and they're allegorical figures. Allegorical figures mean that they use a human figure to represent something else. So they use this female figure to represent science. She's holding a globe. And they use this female figure on the opposite side holding a palette to represent art. So you walk through, and you're walking past 2 statues, and they represent art and science. And then on the building facade itself, you can see that there are seals for the library that were designed by Kenyon Cox, executed by Louis St. Gaudens, Augustus St. Gaudens. Louis St. Gaudens is his younger brother who does the lions that we'll see in just a minute. Just an interesting story about the time period. Augustus St. Gaudens came from a relatively poor family. I think he's a mix of French and Irish, so his parents were immigrants. They came to the United States. They didn't have a lot of money, and Augustus St. Gaudens wanted to go to Paris to study architecture at the École des Beaux-Arts, which would be sort of like your kid saying, I want to study at Harvard, where the tuition is astronomical, where it just seems out of the question. His father took his retirement, cashed it in, took the money, gave it to his son, and sent him to the École des Beaux-Arts. When Augustus came back, he became a very successful artist. He took his money and sent his younger brother to the École des Beaux-Arts to study sculpture. So he learned the lesson of generosity, but he executed those reliefs that you see up above the entrance. And then the doors, by the way, were done by Daniel Chester French. Daniel Chester French is the sculptor who did the Lincoln statue and the Lincoln Memorial. So these are young artists at the time period, just getting their start, just getting established. Here's the plan on the inside. You can see that it's that donut plan that we talked about, where you have a courtyard in the center. You enter right here, where now it wants to go all over. There we go. Where that orange arrow is, you can see that's the entrance path. You enter through a fairly tight space. There are columns on either side that make this space seem narrow. And I'll show you on the next slide. You can see it feels kind of narrow, but you're walking into the light. The idea is here that you're being enlightened. When you go to the library, you're being enlightened. And then you walk up a staircase so that you're ascending, so that you're elevating yourself, is what it's all about to these guys. That it's about improving yourself, that the library is there so the average person can improve themselves. A college is out of the question for a lot of people at the time period, but you can go to the library and you can read books now. So you come into this very narrow, very linear space, and then, now it's going, there we go. You're going up this staircase, and then you come into this stair hall. So you go up the stairs, and the kind of stair that this is called an Imperial Stair. It's the kind of stair that kings had. And what happens is you go up a central flight, and then you split, and you come up either side. So it creates this very grand stair, and then everyone can watch you walk up the staircase in all your fine clothes. But here we have an Imperial Stair for the average person. And when you come up, you pass these 2 reclining lions done by Louis St. Gaudens. And they're a contrast to the 2 human figures at the entrance. So you have man at one end, you have animal at the other. So constantly working with these contrasts. The stair hall is a contrast too, because it has a vertical axis where the entrance had a horizontal axis. You were compressed as you came in, and then when you come here, you're released. And you could see how dark that stair hall was. And then here you're into this hall that's filled with light, covered in this golden sienna marble, that on the walls are mural paintings by Pierre Puvis de Chavannes, who is the most famous mural painter in France at the time period. And France is the country most known for art at that particular period in time. So you're giving people the best. So you bring the best artist at the peak of his career. And if you look at the artwork, it coordinates with the space. I can't imagine a modern artist doing this, where we all have the attitude that we all do our own things. That Chavannes, basically what he said was that he felt his work was subordinate to the architecture, so that he asked Charles McKim to see a sample of the stone, and he matched that golden color in his paintings, that he kept the paintings shallow depth, where you don't feel like the space is being altered because the perspective is so deep in the paintings. He kept them fairly flat so they wouldn't alter the proportions that McKim had established, even though he was much more famous than Charles McKim at the time period. So there's a kind of humility to a lot of these architects and a willingness to work with other people. Here you can just see the murals again, get a better feeling for the color. At the time period, what would happen is you couldn't go to the shelves. They were closed stacks, so that you would go to a delivery room, you'd look in a card catalog, and then you would write down the book you wanted, you'd give it to the librarian, they would go get it and bring it back to you. And that would take some time. Maybe it'd take 15, 20 minutes. In fact, I remember when I was young going to the library and waiting around to get the books that I wanted. And in here, this is the waiting room. It's like a room that you would find in a mansion. It also has mural painting. These are done by Edwin Austin Abbey, who's an American mural painter who studied in England. And it's a contrast to what we saw before. In the other room, the grand stair hall, what happens is we have this golden color stone, we have this kind of cube-like space, we have the vertical movement within the space. Here what we have is horizontal movement again, a darker color palette. We're going with red. If you look at it, almost everything contrasts, so that even the mural painting has more of a medieval quality to it. The theme, it's a narrative theme. It's the quest of the Holy Grail. And so it's telling a story as it goes around, so that it has a completely different character. So what McKim felt was that when you designed a large public building, like when you design a city, it's made up of a series of public spaces. So that within this building are a series of distinct public spaces. Each one has its own character. And so that's what he was working for here. And then we're sort of moving on to the reading room, which is running across the front here. And this is the reading room, so you can see it has a different character too. It's all finished in limestone with a vaulted ceiling that rather than entering on the short side, you enter on the long side. And you look up at this coffered vaulting. This was intended to have a mural program too. Charles McKim wanted to have Whistler paint a painting. In fact, if you look at McKim's sketch, you can see in the background there's the mural that he had intended. What would happen at the time period is the architect would draw something like they wanted, and then the artist would create it. But negotiations with Whistler were so difficult that everybody gave up. And he tried to get another artist. It was too late, so the mural never happened. I've heard all kinds of stories about Whistler. I don't want to say anything bad about anyone, so I won't say it. All right? If you can't say anything good, well, he's a great artist, but difficult personality. I want to move upstairs and show you another room. This is a room which is decorated by John Singer Sargent, who did the murals that I showed you a little earlier. That the theme here is the triumph of religion. And if you look at the character of the room, we had one room that was sort of Renaissance in quality. We had one room that was kind of medieval in quality, one that's kind of Roman in quality. And then here we have something kind of Byzantine in quality. So that we have the gilding, we have a darker mural palette again. And you know, it's just covered with music. This is the persecution of the Israelites under the Egyptians and the Assyrians. But he spent literally decades of his life doing these paintings for a very, very modest fee. And then in the center is one of the most pleasant spaces in Boston. It's the Cortile, and based on the Palazzo Cancelleria in Rome, which you can see in that little square image up at the top. So beautiful space, very quiet and tranquil. If you're ever in Boston and you want a quiet place to eat lunch, get there early because the seats fill up really fast. And then in the center is a statue by a young American artist who had just won one of the prizes at the Paris Salons. That Frederick McManus did the Bacchanti. McKim saw it, he bought it, and donated it to the library. The next major event to occur in the history of the American Renaissance is the World's Columbian exhibition in 1893. It was designed to commemorate Columbus's 400th anniversary of discovering America, coming to America, but it was a year behind schedule. So it's 1893 and not 1892. That what happened here is architects came together from all over the country, so that the best architects in the United States came to work on this particular project. Also, the best young art sculptors and mural painters came here as well. That the architect in charge was Daniel Burnham, a Chicago architect, and his partner created the plan and then died. And kind of unfortunate, died of pneumonia. He went out to talk to Charles McKim was there, and McKim was very famous at the time because of the Boston Public Library, and he walked him out to his car without putting his coat on, and he caught pneumonia and died. And so Burnham is left without a partner, and what happens is a friendship develops between Charles McKim and Daniel Burnham. Now, sometimes we think we have to be good at everything, but nobody is good at everything. And Daniel Burnham was an incredible organizer. He had an exceptional business sense. He was a very persuasive speaker, but he wasn't a particularly talented designer. And he was smart enough to know that. In fact, I read the account of his partner John Root's wife said that as Root was dying, he was saying, "How can you do this to me?" He said, "I depend on you so much. I have the biggest project of my life and you're going to die on me." But he did. But actually, it's probably good for all of us because McKim was a better architect than John Root, and he really handled a lot of the design issues and gave Burnham that confidence to execute this incredible project. What they did, the main feature of it is called the Court of Honor. So it's a large public space. So this idea of creating public spaces, again, it's huge, almost 9 acres in area. So a large space. It has about 7 buildings around it. And each of the 7 buildings are all done by a different architect. It's necessary because they're behind schedule. Not their fault. They weren't given the project until it was 1892. They were given the project and it was supposed to be done in 1892, so that's kind of hard to pull off. But what happened was each of the architects had to design their own building and it had to be done very quickly. The people that Burnham hired were people who had either training at the École des Beaux-Arts or they had studied under someone, worked for someone who had studied at the École des Beaux-Arts. So he tried to get all people who had education. It's that emphasis on education that occurs during this time period. So we have all these different architects working on a building. It could be chaos, but it wasn't. What happened was they all sat down and worked things out. You know, they established a plan for how they were going to design things. One thing they decided to do was that all the buildings would be white. And the reason for that was they were going to spray paint the building. The spray gun was invented for this particular project. So one of the artists came up with the idea of spray paint. And by making all the buildings white, it allowed you to have overspray, and you didn't have to worry about it, so you could work faster. And then it unified the buildings because all the buildings were white, so they had a common color. And then they all had to have a common cornice height. The cornice height is that top edge of the building, and that was established at 60 feet. And then they all had to have the same structural bay, a 20-foot structural bay, so the columns had to be spaced 20 feet apart, which created a consistent rhythm throughout the project. And then they came up with, and they all had to frame that rectangular space that was defined. But then they allowed certain deviations so that at the entrance you could pop up from the 60-foot cornice height. You could pop out from the edge of that plaza that was formed, so that you had this system that allowed for unity, but at the same time it allowed for variation and variety. So it ends up a very interesting space. Had a dramatic influence on the country. About 28 million people came to the fair at a time when the population of the United States was 63 million. So you can see more than a third of the United States was there at the fair, so that everybody saw it, and they all loved this because it was unlike anything that was in America at the time period. That they saw what could happen if architects worked together and they planned things. And not only did architects work together, but sculptors and mural painters worked with them as well. In fact, Augustus St. Gaudens, who was appointed in charge of sculpture at the exhibition, said that it was the greatest gathering of artists since the Renaissance. And it probably was. You know, if you look at one end, we have a fountain by Frederick McMonnies. This fountain in the foreground. And then in the back, we have a statue by Daniel Chester French of the Republic. So it's framed by these two monumental statues, or monumental sculptural pieces. It's a huge space. Now, this is one of the buildings that it was one of the piazzas that it was based on. This is St. Mark's Square. St. Mark's Square is about 3 acres, and it's referred to as the drawing room of Europe. So it's one of the largest public spaces in Europe. That if you look at the way it's designed, you can see they're trying really hard to keep everything uniform, and then one building can deviate from it, which was sort of the model of the Renaissance. You know, if you look at Michelangelo, he's a bit of a radical. So what he has are 2 facades identical, and then the entrance area is different, and then the Palace of the Governors at the back is different. But still, what's happening in the United States is much more diversity. So that what they understand is that if you have a piazza that's almost 9 acres, and you make 2 buildings identical, you may not be able to tell them apart. You know, you may walk into one and then you go over, did I go into that one or didn't I? So that each building has its own character, but they're still unified. So it's not a direct copy of the Renaissance. It's the Renaissance through an American filter. So here you can see that statue of the Republic by Daniel Chester French. And then the focal point here is the administrative building by Richard Morris Hunt, who was, you know, the greatest American architect of that particular moment. that he was the first American to study at the École des Beaux-Arts, so he kind of paved the way for everyone else. And so they recognized that he was the Dean of American Architects, so they gave him the premier building. And his building had to be the tallest. It's 250 feet tall. The dome is copied, or not copied, but based on the dome of the Florence Cathedral, where it's Renaissance dome, and it has that kind of vertical profile. You can see the building there. Each building was decked with sculpture too, so that, you know, this is one of 4 entrances to the administrative building. And that as you enter, you're surrounded by sculptural pieces. These are done by 26-year-old Carl Bitter. So and he did, these are 2, and then on each facade there are 2. And you can see the person in the foreground and the person in the slide, how big they are. I can't imagine any 26-year-old that I've met being able to do something like that. When I think about myself at 26 years old, I couldn't have done anything approaching this. I mean, it's just incredible. One of the themes of the sculpture is this idea of harnessing nature. So these are allegorical pieces again. They're using these figures as a way of representing ideas. And this represents fire controlled and fire uncontrolled. Don't ask me to explain which is which or how it all works. I don't think they even knew. I think they were just more interested in creating beautiful things sometimes, and they just kind of threw this all in. This is the agriculture building, which is done by Charles McKim. That you can see there's pediment sculpture done by Larkin Mead, McKim's partner, the brother of McKim's partner. The angels that are across the attic is this piece right here that goes right above. This piece right here is the attic, and he has a series of angels. Those are done by Phil Martini, who is also very young at the time, 35 years old, which to me seems pretty young to be doing something like this. Up at the top is the statue of Diana by Augustus St. Gaudens. Just a little story about this one. It actually was originally on Madison Square Gardens. What happened was Augustus St. Gaudens designed the statue. They hoisted it up on top of a tower. They got down and looked at it, and St. Gaudens said, "It's too big. It's too big." So what he does is, you know, he's already been paid. He's got his fee. He redoes it and makes it 5 feet shorter and then puts it out there. And then they had one left over, so they brought it here. I can't imagine anyone doing that today, where you would care that much about how something looked. Also mural painting on the inside. Not much of it survives. You know, the fair lasted less than a year, and then it was all destroyed. There's only one building from the fair that still exists, so I mean, it's tragic. The Fine Arts building still exists, but it's the building of science and industry today. And it still looks wonderful on the outside, but the inside has been gutted, so you don't have any feeling for what the interiors were like. But this was done by a young Edwin Blashill, who's a very famous mural painter, or would become a very famous mural painter. All right. After that, you know, it's all destroyed. Yes?
Is it all right to ask a question?
Sure.
Still on the exposition, is it at the same time when Tiffany, the younger, the glassmaker,
Mm-hmm.
did he display murals at that same exhibition?
Yeah, I'm sure he would have, because everybody displayed everything. That
He was of that era.
he was of that era. In fact, McKim used him on a number of projects, so that he would have been used on. Richard Morris Hunt used him on projects as well, so he would have been of that period. And yeah, it is the White City. Next building is Library of Congress. Library of Congress was going on while the fair was going on. And it's not a true American Renaissance building. that it's done in an Italian style, but it has a lot of Victorian elements. You know, if you look at it, it's kind of broken up into a lot of pieces. Even though it has the horizontal lines, there are a lot of towers and things on it. So it wasn't quite American Renaissance yet, but what happened was the architect was fired. In fact, the architect was fired twice, so that the competition was won by Smithmeyer and Pels, an Austrian and a German architect. Everyone decided that Smithmeyer really wasn't the brains behind the project, so he got sacked. And then Pels got sacked. And when Pels got sacked, 26-year-old architect he had graduated from the École des Beaux-Arts, and he had come to the United States, established his office in New York, and his father got the job as general contractor. General Casey, basically what General Casey did was he fired the existing architect and hired his son. And this makes a case for nepotism, because his son produced something that was much greater than Smithmeyer or Pels could ever have produced. That basically what he's responsible is for integrating all the art into the building. And it starts at the sidewalk. So at the sidewalk, we have a fountain, the Neptune Fountain by, I forget, Roland, his name slips my mind. What? Roland Perry. So Roland Perry does this beautiful fountain based on the Trevi Fountain in Rome. And then you go up the steps and you come to the entrance, and we have art galore. That the doors are all done by artists. That Bella Pratt did these, it's hard to see here, but there are human figures up in that little wedge above the arches. And they're representing things like science and art and commerce. That the doors are all designed. I'll show you a pair of the doors. Running across the top are a series of statues by famous Americans, people, you know, like Benjamin Franklin, Hawthorne, you know, famous writers. There are all kinds of statues there. So right from the very beginning. Whoops, I went back. Here are the doors. So again, these are allegorical figures, you know, illustrating aspects of a great civilization. You know, that's the theme of the library, is a great civilization. So components of a great civilization are imagination and memory. So imagination is depicted there, the female figure with the lyre, and then memory is the woman holding the helmet, you know, the soldier that has fallen, so that you remember the past and you create something new for the future. Then on the inside, you know, this is just the entrance lobby. Running all across the front are statues of Minerva, the Minerva of War and the Minerva of Peace. The Minerva of War holds the torch, and she has a sword in one hand, and then the Minerva of Peace has the globe in her hand. And then we come into the grand stair hall. This is one of the richest public interiors in the United States. If you've never seen it, I encourage you to go. When I went to school, I got a master's in architectural history, and we never talked about the Library of Congress. And I was working in Washington, D.C., and I was all alone there, and I would just wander around the mall area on weekends. And I just saw this building said Library of Congress, and I just walked in and was blown away. I mean, it's just an unbelievably beautiful interior. You know, so we have all this white marble on the inside. Phil Martini, who did those angels on the agriculture building, he was the architect for most of the sculpture in this room. And it's really fun. What he did was baby professions. So lining the staircase are little putti, like little babies, and they depict the various professions. I'll show you two of them here. So what we have is painting, architecture, and sculpture, all done with the babies. What they believed during the Renaissance and in the American Renaissance was that the human form was created by God, and it was beautiful, whether it was a man, a woman, or a baby. And each of those represented a different kind of beauty. And what I like about it is it has a kind of comic quality too. They even have a town drunk baby. You know, so that on the stair, they have this baby and he has a little glass and he's tipping it back. But every single profession that you can think of is represented. And then even the angels up in the ceiling, so these plaster angels that you see here, that those are by Martini as well. I can't imagine just doing that much work in a relatively short amount of time. And then just the contrast between the white marble and the murals that you see up there, so that all these artists from the World's Columbian exhibition were brought on board and they were painting and sculpting all of the work for the Library of Congress, which is open to all of us. I knew someone would ask if this is Tiffany Glass, and I don't think it is. I looked and looked, and I couldn't find, found the name of the installer, but nothing about it being Tiffany. But it's beautiful nonetheless. In fact, you could I spend in the class I teach a whole lecture on this building alone, and you can just keep zooming in, and it gets more and more beautiful. You feel like when you're there, you need a ladder or scaffolding so you can get up and see everything. You enter through a triumphal arch. I guess it's telling me to hurry up. I will. But you enter through a triumphal arch, which is a theme during this period. It's something from ancient Rome. In ancient Rome, what would happen is when a general came back from a victory, they would build an arch and they would march through the arch, and they would have all these captives follow them. And then all the loot that they gathered from the war, they would bring through. And then the arch would commemorate that. What's happening here is the arch is commemorating learning, so that there are two figures there. The figures represent the young scholar and the old scholar. So the idea that learning is something that you do throughout your entire life. And so you're walking through that, and then you're coming into the main reading room, which they don't let you in. It's kind of a raw deal that, we all paid for this, and we're not allowed to come in, or our ancestors paid for it. But you can get special permission if you demonstrate that you have some need for studying things, and they'll have the books for you so you can go in. But it's an incredible space, this huge dome space that it's octagonal room, and then it's covered by a dome, and you make the transition from the octagon to the dome through pendentives, which are these sort of curving triangular pieces that you see. I can't find that arrow. Well, anyway, you can see there's a series of curved triangular pieces. At each one of those, there's a column, and at the column, there's a figure that represents one of the cornerstones of civilization. So the two that are depicted here are art and history, but there's commerce and law. I'm trying to remember what some of the science and religion. Two that I'm forgetting, poetry and philosophy. I don't think you need to read too much into it, but just the idea that those are being represented. And then right below them, so that if we look, here's the figure of art, and art is holding a model of the Pantheon, the Parthenon in Athens. And then below, on either side, there are two figures. They would do this thing where they would have female figures and they would have male figures, so that they tried to keep a balance in them. And that's why a lot of the allegorical figures are women and the historical figures are male, is a way of keeping that balance between men and women throughout the building. So we have Michelangelo representing the visual arts, and we have Beethoven representing music. And then similar thing happens with history. You can see the statues down below there, so that you have the allegorical figure, then you have two representatives of that profession. So here's history, Herodotus, the Greek historian, and then Gibbon, the author of Rise and Fall of the Roman Empire. And then up at the top, remember Blashfield? Edwin Blashfield, who painted that mural at the fair? Well, he's up here painting the mural at the top of the dome in Washington, D.C. in the summer. And he painted it directly on the dome. Last time he ever painted anything in situ at the site, because it was so hot and he was so miserable. After that, they developed a technique where they would paint them in their studio, and then they would use this special glue and they would glue them into place so that you wouldn't have that problem. But basically what he has is around the collar of the dome, we have all the cultures that contributed to Western civilization. Everyone complains about the cultures that are left out, but keep in mind these people are artists, so they're using a number that works well visually. If you get too many in there, it gets kind of busy, so that if your culture isn't there, don't worry about it. That it's just what happened to be picked at the time. The United States is there, and what we're offering is engineering. So if you think about it, at the time period, that was probably the greatest contribution that was being made by the United States were contributions in engineering. The fair had an incredible effect. It's difficult to underestimate the effect of the fair. That not only did it inspire the Library of Congress, but it inspired the redesign of many cities so that Daniel Burnham became an urban planner. And what happened is, this was, at this time period, it was the centennial of L'Enfant's plan for Washington, D.C., and so they're thinking, we should restore that plan. It kind of deteriorated over the years, and his plan basically was we had the Capitol building, so he located the Capitol building, located the White House, created an axis between the two buildings, and at the point where those two axes met was where the site for the Washington Monument would be. What happened was a mess. They went to build the Washington Monument, they ran into bad soil, and they had to shift it off axis in both directions. So it no longer lines up with the White House or the Capitol. So there's no relationship there. And then the mall just looked like this. This is Washington, D.C. in 1901. It's just chaos. There are buildings scattered all over. There's no plan. That L'Enfant had planned to have this mall, this formal mall or lawn run all the way to the Washington Monument, and there are all kinds of things obstructing that view. That we have the Baltimore and Ohio rail line runs through the mall area. In fact, they have a train shed that covers half of the mall. So you're out for a walk, your dog gets loose and gets hit by a train. It's just a terrible setup, and just really ugly too. And people realized it. One person that realized it was a Michigan senator, James McMillan, and he proposed a plan to restore L'Enfant's plan. And they hired Daniel Burnham to do it. And what do you think Daniel Burnham's going to do? He's going to hire his right-hand man. So he hires Charles McKim. And he goes and designs a new railroad, and he says, Charles, you design the mall. What McKim does is nothing short of brilliant. That what he does to realign things, he skews the whole mall at an angle. If you look at this plan and you look at the two streets on either side, you'll see that the mall isn't parallel to them, that it's skewed, and the reason it's skewed is so that it lines up with the Washington Monument. It was impossible to do anything. The White House is too close to do something like that. So what he does is he creates a round reflecting pool in front of the monument. And then, because you can see through, he creates a cross-axis. And terminating the cross-axis is a monument to the framers of the Constitution, which would later become the Jefferson Memorial. And then, he continues that axis past the Washington Monument, reclaims some of the land from the Potomac, and proposes a monument. At the time, people wanted a Grant Memorial. Charles McKim's father was a famous abolitionist, and McKim had a pretty good knowledge of history from his father, and he knew that Lincoln was the more important figure. So McKim has more nicknames than any person I know. One of his nicknames is Charming Charlie. And what he would do, I read an account of one of the industrialists that had worked with him, and he said that what he would do is he'd say, "No, Charles, I don't want to do that." And he said Charles would say, "No problem at all, I'll take care of it." And then he said, "Okay, no, let's do this." And he would say exactly what he said before. And he said he was always polite, he never lost his temper, but he never changed his mind. And people would, that was J.P. Morgan, and J.P. Morgan, who pretty tough negotiator, said, "He just wore me down." And what he did was he was fairly clever. He said, "Well, why don't we make a Grant Memorial that's the bridge to Arlington Cemetery? That would be more appropriate." And so, another architect got the contract, and they proposed the bridge. Here's what he proposed for the Washington Monument, by the way, where you can see that area in front. Here's his design for the Lincoln Memorial. Unfortunately, McKim died before the Lincoln Memorial was completed, so his assistant, Henry Bacon, took it over, and he's been given credit for the design. But you can see it's pretty close to the Lincoln Memorial at this point, with a big reflecting pool in front of it. Here's before the bridge went in, so you can see this is pretty much the way it was intended to be. There's the design by Henry Bacon, and then there's the Lincoln statue by Daniel Chester French. Just a quick story on Daniel Chester French. He came from a very successful family, and he was that completely useless son. His father loved him, but he couldn't do anything. They were all successful lawyers, and they're in government, and they had this son who just seemed to have no aptitude for anything. And one day, the mother was just trying everything to find something that her son could do, and she brought home some clay, and he started making things out of clay that were just incredible. And fortunately came from a family with some resources, and his father sent him to Italy to study sculpture and ended up becoming a great sculptor. This is that Grant Memorial Bridge, but the Grant Memorial Bridge didn't fly. And the reason is that Triumphal Arch that you see there. So they have a Triumphal Arch, and think of the Roman image, that you'd capture the people, you'd bring all your slaves back to Rome, and you'd march them through the arch. So you can imagine how the Southerners felt about that one. Didn't go over well, so that got nixed. What McKim did was he said, Grant is too important to be way down here, knowing that really visually this was the most important spot. And he said he should be up by the Capitol. So he proposed Union Square, and how many people have ever seen the Grant Memorial? It's right in front of the Capitol. It's completely overshadowed. It's invisible, but everybody knows the Lincoln Memorial. And we have Charles McKim to thank for that. This is the way the bridge was actually designed, where it's flatter, lower key, so it doesn't compete with the Lincoln Memorial. So when you're coming from Arlington, you can clearly see the Lincoln Memorial. Unfortunately, up here, I can't see the images that this is the Grant Memorial. So it's Union Square, and you can see that done by Casey again, that young architect from the Library of Congress, and you can see an equestrian statue of Grant there looking over the mall. And then here's the actual project. I want to move to Minnesota now and talk about Cass Gilbert. Cass Gilbert was I'll pick it up, I promise. Cass Gilbert was someone who apprenticed under McKim, and White. You know, they were a famous teaching firm. So he came out of McKim's office. He didn't study at the École des Beaux-Arts. He did make a trip to Europe to study things, but he couldn't afford to study there. But I think he was in his mid-30s when he got the commission to do the capital for the Minnesota State Capitol. So if you can imagine being someone in your mid-30s and doing a project like this, that it's all done in white Georgian marble, which caused a bit of a problem because Minnesota is known for stone. And it created such a public outcry that he didn't back down either, but he did leave the state. So he was a Minnesota architect, and he moved his firm to New York after that experience. The dome up at the top is based on the dome of St. Peter's in Rome. So you can see the two of them side by side, and you can see it's very close where they're drawing from these Renaissance ideas. And you can see what we have up at the top there, you can see that gold piece is a quadriga. Quadrigas typically went on top of triumphal arches, and it would be representative of the general on his chariot, coming through town. Here, rather than a general, what we have is the state of Minnesota. So we have an allegorical figure representing the state of Minnesota. Then we have 4 horses. The 4 horses represent the elements, earth, air, fire, and water. And then they're being led by 2 women that represent civilization. So oftentimes female figures were used to represent civilization. You can see the balance between male and female figures as well. So when you have the lower point, there are 2 of you. When you have the high point, there's 1. It's the reverse in the Library of Congress, where you have the 2 males and the 1 female figure up at the top. So this idea of balancing. And then on the inside, a rigorous mural program. Cass Gilbert took the people involved in the decision-making to the Library of Congress and showed them what could be done, and they were inspired. And many of the same artists were brought here to paint murals. I want to show you one by Blashfield. I wanted to show you this one because people who were at the Chicago Fair said it was very similar to a mural that he did there, where it has these 2 oxen. Minnesota again is leading the oxen, and then we have figures representing patriotism and agriculture on either side. Cass Gilbert did a project in the Detroit area, the Detroit Public Library. And you can see Italian Renaissance again. On the inside, if you've never been there, there are murals by Charles Blashfield that, not his best work, but pretty good. That I think at the time period he was getting paid by the number of figures, and because he has way too many figures in the paintings. I've tried to count them, and there are so many that are beyond count. But on one side, there's a lunette, that arched element that represents prose. The other side represents poetry. And then we have the visual arts on the cross-axis. And opposite that, we have the musical arts. So they're beautiful paintings that are murals that are in our own backyard, and so you can get a little feeling for the time period. Here you can see those paintings on either side of that cross-axis. And then also the book Cadillac Hotel was done by Lewis Camper. Lewis Camper studied under McKim, Mead, and White, so worked in their office as well. And you can see it has a rich sculptural program too. So this is in the attic. There are figures important to the history of Detroit. Antoine Cadillac, I think, is the second figure in the founder of the fort that had the name Detroit, that Detroit is based on. Chief Pontiac. or General Wayne, so other important figures. Those were done by Adolf Weinman. Adolf Weinman was a young sculptor who was working with Daniel Chester French on the Lincoln Memorial. So we have, someone who worked on the Lincoln Memorial, came to Detroit and was working on these statues as well. Daniel Chester French and Henry Bacon, the architect sculptor team that was present at the Lincoln Memorial, did a memorial to Alger. Also, Daniel Burnham's partner, Edwin Bennett, came to Detroit and did a plan for Detroit, a master plan for Detroit. Unfortunately, a lot of the pieces weren't done, but many were. So that the cultural district, he called it the Center of Arts and Letters, where the art museum, the library, the historical museum is. The Detroit Zoo was part of his proposal. We have the Linked Riverfront Parks project that he actually proposed continuous park along the waterfront from Lake Erie to Lake St. Clair. So, we would have outstripped Chicago if we would have followed his plan. But enough of it is there, so I think it enriches the city and you get a feeling for what it was like. He also planned to add additional diagonals, connecting the Michigan Central Station and also going up and connecting to Belle Isle. The end of the American Renaissance coincides with the end of World War I. What happened after World War I is much of the optimism that generated the American Renaissance faded away. So people thought they were on the verge of creating this great civilization, and what happened was there's this war that was worse, more terrible than any of the wars that had preceded it. And what happened is people got more pessimistic. Also, that was followed by the Depression, which didn't help either, that there wasn't the money, or if there was the money, that people felt guilty spending it, which was bad because if they would have spent the money rather than holding on to it, they could have created jobs for people. But and then also the advent of modernism too. The Armory exhibition, where Cubism and Futurism were displayed, sort of got a lot of the universities hired modernist professors, and it changed the course of architecture in the United States. Sort of the last holdout was someone who had studied under Charles McKim, John Russell Pope. He also studied at the École des Beaux-Arts. He had a degree from Columbia, a degree from the École des Beaux-Arts, so he's probably the most educated architect of the time period. This great architect did the National Gallery in Washington, D.C., the National Archives. You can see if you look at the building, much more stripped down than, we don't have the sculpture, don't have the ornamentation, the inside. This is based on the Pantheon in Rome that some sculpture, but fairly minimal. That his last project was this one here, the Jefferson Memorial, completing much of McKim's plan. That unfortunately what happened was he had funding for the project and he was working on it, and there was a letter writing campaign to stop the project. A lot of modern architects, Frank Lloyd Wright wrote a rather nasty, cruel letter saying that Thomas Jefferson would have hated this design. Thomas Jefferson would have hated Frank Lloyd Wright. It was the truth that the dean of Harvard wrote a letter disparaging it. And what really hurt was the entire faculty of Columbia, his alma mater, signed a letter condemning his design. Congress withdrew funds and the project was stopped. And 4 days later, he died. But he had a wife that would just not let it drop. And she started her own letter writing campaign. And she was related to Franklin Delano Roosevelt, who was president at the time. And she was sending those letters directly to him. And so what happened was his wife got the project back on the books, and it was executed. Slightly smaller scale, but it was built. And that was pretty much the end of the American Renaissance. Any questions? Yes?
Did you say they destroyed all the buildings and buildings?
Yeah, what happened was they were abandoned, and vagrants moved into the buildings, and they would start fires to keep themselves warm, and they burned down. All of them except for the Palace of Fine Arts, which isn't one of the buildings on the Court of Honor. But it was done by the same architect who did the peristyle at the back, Charles Atwood. It's a real tragedy when you... they were built out of a material called staff, which was sort of an exterior grade of plaster that was designed to withstand weather for a short period of time. So no matter what, they were going to be down eventually, but it's kind of unfortunate that they weren't preserved in some way, that a lot of the sculpture could have been taken off the buildings and put into museums, and maybe some of the mural paintings saved, although it was kind of hard because they were painted directly into plaster at that time period. Other questions? Yes?
Do we know anything about how these projects were funded, public projects, the libraries, et cetera, et cetera, et cetera?
Yeah, I do. That some of them were publicly funded, like the Boston Public Library was publicly funded. A lot of the funding for libraries came from Carnegie. So Carnegie gave up half of his fortune to build public libraries. I think at one point in history, half of the public libraries in the United States had Carnegie funding. And I know at one time the Detroit Public Library, he offered funding for the Detroit Public Library, and they turned it down, but later they built the library, and so I think they did use Carnegie funding for that as well. Any other questions? All right, yes.
The Triumphal Arches, so it was back in Rome, and those have been painted. Like, somebody told me that they painted.
Certainly in Greek architecture, they painted things. In Egyptian architecture, they painted things. That I'm not as certain about Rome being painted, but there may have been some painting on them. In fact, even on the buildings here, on the Chicago Fair, some things were painted, not the sculpture, but there was some color used in area like the underside of soffits and ceilings, and things on the exterior were painted. But in Greece and Rome, in Greece and Egypt, the buildings were completely painted, so they would have no exposed stone at all. Any other questions?
On behalf of our group that came out tonight, Joe, thank you very much.
It was a pleasure. And thank you for your patience.
We're going to get Joe I think give him a little money certificate to get a massage for both of his arms for holding up the... Joe also came with his wife and his son. And again, on behalf of Smart Towns, on behalf of the Rochester Hills Public Library, thank you so much for sharing your background knowledge tonight. Thank you. Well, ladies and gentlemen, that's it for tonight. April 25th is the next program. I hope we'll see you again. And thanks for coming out tonight.